Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Hey, thank you so very, very much, and welcome everyone to a new week of broadcast here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. Today is the 5th day of June in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be live here on the air, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the 5th of June 2017. And I say that to kind of flag the broadcast in case people are looking for it as an archive later. It is a pleasure to be with you, as I mentioned. I want to thank everyone for your continued support for the Head On Radio Network and for this particular program. We've had some issues, but Bob has assured me that he's been playing with the equipment for days now, and he thinks he's got most of the gremlins out of it, and I think we finally got Skype working the way we hope it can work. Right now it's perfect, and Bob and I have been chatting on the phone for 10, 15 minutes or so before we went on the air, and everything sounds great. So let's be optimistic and let's be positive. There's an awful lot going on, I think, as everybody knows, and since we've last been together, of course, President Trump has made the decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement and go in a separate direction from 195 other nations and join I believe Nicaragua and Syria as the only two other nations that have consciously refused to participate in the Paris climate agreements. The implications of this are incredible. And of course, this past Saturday night, as you know, we had another terrorist attack in London. And this particular one seems to be having the kind of impact that I think all of us suspected that this might lead to, as different organizations are beginning to go at each other over the response. There's some indication this morning in a very, very informative piece that I saw in the New York Times about 30 minutes before we went on the air, that apparently the networks themselves are chipping at each other over criticism of President Trump on the one hand and as to strategies for dealing with terrorism on the other and all the rest of it. We'll get into a lot of this stuff on our program today because I think it's very important that we try to close the gap and touch a few bases on a number of different issues that have been going simultaneously that we really haven't had a chance to talk about. Let me first of all not only welcome you to the Virtual Center and to today's program, but invite you to take advantage of the opportunities to go on the air and share your thoughts, concerns, ideas with others who are tuned in to our little operation here on the Head On Radio Network. We have a phone number, and if you dial 304-663-4676, that'll take you directly into the Head On studios. And Bob Kincaid is there today, and he'll be more than glad to get you on the air immediately. We would love to hear from you. Our other listeners would, I know. So please don't hesitate. If you have something that you would like to share or something that you would like to put out there for reaction, by all means, take advantage of this opportunity to do it. If you've got something you'd like to get on the air or get out there, as it were, and you're a little bit uncomfortable about doing it yourself by going on the air using the phone, and you'd like to drop me an email and share your thoughts with me, I'd be glad to do the very best I can to represent you and your ideas and your thoughts on the air. I wouldn't do it I would try as much as possible to not editorialize on everything you do. I would try as best I can to do your position on whatever issue it is, do justice. So if you would drop me an email, I'd be glad to take care of that for you, and I'll get it on the air. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. I also call your attention to our Facebook page. I have, over this past weekend, I have taken to getting back on our Facebook page on a regular basis. I've posted 3 or 4 different things on Facebook over the last couple of days, mostly links to particular articles that I thought were substantive and worthy of significance. A couple of those I'd like to maybe address in today's program, and if not today's program, then perhaps tomorrow. If you go to Facebook, to the homepage, there's a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page. So we have a number of different opportunities and ways that you can weigh in on some of the issues of the day and some of the commentary that you pick up here, both on the Head On Radio Network generally and here at the Virtual Center as well. And all I want you to do is rest assured that you should not worry that your opinions don't mean anything or that they aren't worthy of airtime. Indeed, they are. And, if you are a regular participant in the Head On Radio Network broadcasts or here at the Virtual Center, it pretty much stands to reason, and we can take it to the bank, the fact that you have a fairly good idea of what you're talking about and that your thoughts and your ideas would be of interest to other people. So please take advantage of this. I think it's very important. I was out this morning, and we're having quite a bit of rain here today, as I know other people in the middle part of the country are. But I was thinking about today being the beginning of June 5th. And I was thinking, this is 3 months into, it's unbelievable. We began on the 11th of March, 2013. And so we're beyond 4 years and into 3 months into our 5th year as of the 11th of this month, six more days. We will be 4 years and 3 months into this program. It's absolutely amazing to me that we've been doing it for this long, and that it's still as much fun, at least for me. And I, over the years, months and years, I've believed very, very strongly that many of the things that we're dealing with are substantive, and as events have unfolded, they have done little to dissuade me from recognizing the importance of this opportunity. And I think that's one thing that I know I have never wavered on, and that's recognizing the importance of this. This is an opportunity. It's a gift, and it's an important gift. It's an important opportunity, and it's needed. And again, I don't just mean this program. I mean the Head On Radio Network itself. We don't have advertisers. We don't have people telling us that there are certain topics we should or should not touch on, or that when we deal with certain products, we should present it this way rather than that way or rather than the other way. The whole point is we're not delivering a message. We're trying to encourage conversation, reflection, thought, because I think that's very important. Because obviously, in many of these things, we think that ultimately some sort of activity, some sort of action is going to be necessary. We want that action to be thoughtful and well thought out and well discussed and that kind of thing. So, welcome to the program. And with that, I'd like to get into the program by touching on a number of things. probably this is most recent. I have a number of items that are left over from that I was going to deal with last week, and then we ran into some technical issues, as you know. But the situations or circumstances keeps developing, and it seems very, very difficult. You kind of just have to keep running faster and faster in order to keep up, as it were. I think a lot of this we speak specifically to the occupant in the White House, who's moving at breakneck speed, it seems. And it's very, very difficult for a lot of people to keep up. There was a piece in this morning's New York Times on the international economy and on the decision reached late last week by the president to withdraw from the Paris Accords on climate. And I'm thinking of the president's Rose Garden appearance, in which he announced that we were withdrawing from the Paris Accords. And the author of this, and what called my attention, of course, was the author itself. The author is Lawrence Summers. And many of you will remember that Lawrence Summers was an important figure in the Obama administration. He is a professor at Harvard. He was president of Harvard for a time, and then he got into some negative publicity and was forced to step down from that particular post. But he's still one of the brightest commentators on the world situation. And the reason I mention this is because he's writing on a topic that I had planned to address today anyway. So, and ironically, it seems, what he has to say fits very, very well into some of the things that I was going to throw out there for your consideration on this particular issue. Let me share with you, first of all, this piece by Lawrence Summers, the last week in history. And he asked the question, after 75 years, was last week a hinge taken with the use of the term hinge in his title? If you think of a hinge, if you think of a door, and it's the hinges that allow the door to swing back, close, as it were. And so basically what it means is, in the title, referring to last week in history, hinge in history, it suggests, obviously, the reality, namely that our president has taken us in a different than the one we've been 3/4 of a century. And so therefore, by asking the question, the mere fact that he writes the article suggests that Lawrence Summers himself believes that last week and this particular decision was a hinge. Let me quote the way that Lawrence Summers expresses this by calling last week a hinge in history. He says, a moment when the United States and the world started moving on a path away from peace, prosperity, and stability that have defined the past 75 years. So the implication here, or not necessarily the implication, Lawrence Summers' opening paragraph suggests not only is that the United States has made the decision to go in a different direction from the one we've been going in over the last 5 years, it's not only a believes, it's a mistaken direction that we're heading in. And then he points out that over the last 75 years, the situation in the United States, the situation that the United States finds itself in as the leader of the world through most of the 20th century has been very positive. And this is one of the areas I wanted to comment on about this particular article. Let me quote Lawrence Summers. Progress is too slow, he says, and not well enough shared. But Americans have never lived so well. This has been driven by remarkable developments in human thought, especially in science and technology, and a relatively stable global order that has been underwritten by the United States. Basically, he says that the rate of fatalities in war over the last 75 years has steadily declined, and growing integration throughout the world has driven global growth and improvements in life expectancy and living standards. Summers is not the first person to make the suggestion or to recognize that this approach that our foreign policy has taken over the last 3/4 of a century has probably done more to alleviate poverty in the world than at any period in the world's history up until now. The emphasis on globalism, which became a reality at the end of the 20th century and moving into the 21st century, the fact of the matter is, by creating more and more of a worldwide economic sphere based on commerce and trade and interaction among nations, not only has the world been stable, but economically, this whole stress toward globalism has done a great deal to alleviate significant pockets of poverty in the world. However, it's important to recognize, and of course this is not what Summers' article is about, so he doesn't go into this. But I don't want to let the opportunity go because he raises the question as to the fact that, quote, Americans have never lived so well. The fact of the matter is, if all Americans agreed with that, we wouldn't have Donald Trump as our president. It's pretty obvious that what happened last November at the polls on November 8th indicates that an awful lot of Americans didn't really agree that they never had it so well. On the contrary, many of them obviously believed that a change was called for. And that change is reflected in the person of the occupant of the White House currently. It's very obvious then, and this I think is important because this is the role that Lawrence Summers played in the Obama administration. And that is that much of this expansion throughout the world and the alleviation of poverty, the raising of all boats, so to speak, by the expansion and growth of trade and commerce throughout the world, has to a large extent occurred at the expense of the living standards in many of the most developed nations, specifically ours, Great Britain's. There's no question that the reason Great Britain left the European Union in the Brexit vote last year was because so many Brits were displeased with the way the world was going. So the very positive comments that Lawrence Summers makes about growing integration in the world that has driven global growth and improvements in life expectancy and living standards throughout the world is obviously true, but it has been at the expense of the quality of life and standard of living in many of the developed nations, Great Britain being one, the United States being the other. The decision in Great Britain to leave the European Union the election of Donald Trump and the rejection of Hillary Clinton, rejection of the past, the establishment past, so to speak, speaks volumes to the hostility, frustration, the anger, and the absence of hope in the persons of so many people in this country as they have seen their jobs and their futures exit the country. Now, please be aware that, and again, I think this is not something we don't know. All I want to do is make sure that we kind of keep it in mind all the time. It's not the administration specifically that does this. In other words, the movement of jobs, the relocation of jobs from this country overseas for purposes of reduced costs in labor and productivity, production, and all the rest of it, are economic decisions made by corporations. In other words, they are the instruments. But ultimately, it's the kind of world economic environment which makes this possible, which has created the situation. My point here is just to make the point that Lawrence Summers obviously believes that what's been going on over the last 3/4 of a century, and especially the last 25 years or so, with the emphasis on globalism and global expansion and economic growth shared throughout the world, is a positive. And I'm not saying that it isn't. What I'm saying is it's very important to keep in mind that for some people it wasn't a positive. And it's that contradiction that it seems to me all of us need to deal with. It's that contradiction, the flow of refugees and immigrants coming into nations like Great Britain, that many people believe are responsible for the violence and the events of terrorism that we just witnessed this past weekend. Donald Trump's taking to Twitter, once again on this, to make a comment advocating his so-called travel ban, which the courts have held up, suggests the contradiction and the conflict that all of us feel. There's absolutely no question that Donald Trump is playing to his base here. He is basically speaking for the dispossessed, those that elected him, on this particular issue. By making the decision to withdraw from the Paris Accords, President Trump has done some things which really do suggest that this nation is embarking on movement in a different direction from the one that it has been in. Summers points out that even though Donald Trump, throughout the campaign, spoke to these issues and basically said what he would do if he ever got the opportunity, many people refuse to take it that seriously. Most people believe, along with the pollsters and the experts, that Trump didn't have a chance to win anyway. But even after he did win, many people became relieved when they saw some of the appointments that President Trump had made, because it appeared that as far as the international situation was concerned, President Trump had surrounded him with establishment advisors that would more than likely keep him on the straight and narrow and make sure that nothing too dramatically different happened. Up until last week, Summers said, This seemed to be holding. Up until last week, this seemed to be optimism well placed. That the McMasters and the Cohns and some of these other advisors, Gary Cohn, McMasters, National Security Advisor, Gary Cohn, Director of the National Economic Council, these would be the kind of people that would keep Trump from doing anything too dramatically different that would jeopardize anything we already had. And then last week, McMaster and Gary Cohn co-authored a piece in the Washington Post in which they took issue with what American foreign policy has been focused on since the end of World War I. They said in their article, and this is a quote, "The world is not a global community. The world is not a global community. And therefore, they were speaking for the world that existed prior to the approach that American foreign policy has taken for the bulk of the time through the 20th century and into the 21st. More specifically, by rejecting the idea that the world is a global community, McMaster and Cohn were siding with President Trump on the idea that international relations ought not to be aimed at creating cooperative friendships, organizations, World Trade Organizations, and other ways to promote the global community. Rather, our foreign policy ought to be directed in a different direction. And that ultimately, what we were returning to, this article in the Wall Street Journal suggests, was something like the British and the French pursued at Versailles at the end of World War I. And then the president took his overseas trip, the 9-day overseas trip that took him to the Middle East and to the NATO meeting in Brussels, and then back to the G7 in Sicily. And the president spoke out against NATO. He didn't attack NATO, but he urged the others to step up and pay their fair share. He basically refused to reaffirm America's security commitments to NATO. And then last week, he abandoned American participation in the Paris Global Climate Agreement. Summers predicts that there are going to be consequences to all of this. Just as he says there were to the pursuit of short-term advantage rather than stability at Versailles. He's not so concerned with the concern of those who believe that China is going to move into the leadership void that we've created by leaving. Summers believes that it's up to others in the United States to separate themselves from the position of President Trump. It is essential, he says, that leaders in the U.S. society signal clearly their disapproval of the course that the administration is taking. He praises Elon Musk of Tesla, Robert Iger of Disney, who resigned presidential appointments because they couldn't agree with the direction that President Trump wanted to take the nation. The question then that Summers raises is whether in fact other leaders in the country are going to be willing to step up to the point that they can reassure Europe and the other people that are still in the Paris Accords that America supports efforts to save the climate, efforts to save the planet. Ultimately, he says, of course, and this is his last sentence, Congress has a central role to play in preventing dangerous and destabilizing steps. Of course, this raises a number of questions. Whether, in fact, Congress is going to play a meaningful role in anything when it comes to taking issue with President Trump. Because the fact of the matter is, say what you want about the behavior and the activities and actions of the president, he is providing cover for Congress. He's signing the pieces of legislation Republican leaders in Congress want signed. It's obvious, at least so far, that they are willing to take the bad with the good. They're willing to accept the negatives in order to retain the assurance that when they have a particular piece of legislation that requires the president's signature, they'll get it. That, I would suggest, is really what seems to be motivating Congress. So as the investigations in President Trump's and the Russian connection continue to take off, with the Thursday appearance of former FBI Director Comey before Congress being the highlight of this week, it's very obvious, and a number of commentators have pointed this out, that ultimately all of this is going to revert back to the congressional leadership, or more specifically, the Republican leadership. Commentators have pointed over and over again to the disconnect within the Republican Party between conservative leaders of the party on the one hand and the president's behavior on the other. Because there's absolutely no question that much of what President Trump says and does contradict the basic premises, the basic tenets of conservatism. They aren't things that committed conservatives can easily support. But so far, there's been no indication that anything different than what has already been going on will continue to go on. I mentioned that one of the reasons I wanted to raise Summers's article with you is because it touched on a few things that I wanted to share that I had planned to address today anyway. And one of them is this return by rejecting the Paris Climate Agreement and going in a different direction from the bulk of the world's nations, other nations. The United States was rejecting the Pax Americana role that America played throughout much of the 20th century. And of course, with the two world wars in the 20th century, World War I at the beginning and World War II just prior to the middle of the century, the reality is that the United States emerged from World War II as the dominant economic and political power in the world. We came out of World War I as a dominant industrial power, because World War I, since it was fought out on the continent of Europe, the United States did not suffer any of the devastation. We lost life, of course, but nothing in comparison to what European nations lost. Europe was on its knees at the end of World War I. And as we know, the priority of the United States through the 1920s was to rebuild Europe, recognizing, of course, that America's economic success depended to a large degree on Europe's economic success. Recognition of the realities of global commercial interaction. And that perspective is what really defined America's role through the 20th century. Let's go back, and this is pretty much straight out of the history books, but I think it's significant. Let's go back to the end of World War I. Let's look specifically at the realities of America's economic priorities and political priorities at the end of World War I. More specifically, Woodrow Wilson's plan to guarantee that World War I would indeed be the war to end all wars. Based on that, Wilson developed a 14-point program, which he believed, if the world organized around, we could effectively make this war the last war among civilized nations. And we've, in the past here at the Virtual Center, touched on some of the details of Wilson's 14-point plan. I don't necessarily plan on doing that, but let me just quickly touch on several. There's absolutely no question that Wilson's goal for world peace after World War I was based on the model developed at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century in Asia, the so-called open door policy that's characterized with the open door notes of John Hay in the late 19th century. As we know, the United States became a world power at the end of the 19th century. When the United States made the decision coming out of the Spanish-American War in 1898 to take territory from defeated Spain, specifically the Philippines and Cuba, the United States had entered a new phase in its role in the world. The United States had joined the other nations of Europe as a major world power. And the United States knew that status would give it the opportunity to become a player in the competition for control of the market in China. Also, the United States held Cuban independence from Spain at the end of the Spanish-American War. And for all practical purposes, Cuba reverted from being a colony of Spain to becoming a mandate of the United States. On paper, Cuba was required to get American approval for any significant foreign policy development that the Cuban government chose to get into. Every treaty had to meet muster within the United States. We looked on Cuba because of its geographical position 90 miles off the coast of Florida, critical to America and to America's commercial future. And therefore, we took it upon ourselves to claim the right to control what Cuba did and how Cuba did it. Cuba's future was linked directly to our own. We made sure of that. And that is, I believe, what history records as the Platt Amendment, which laid out specific requirements that the Cuban government had to meet in order to satisfy America's preeminent role in its own decision-making. The United States had made the decision to become a world power, to become a global power. And as we entered the 20th century, we were that. We were a major economic producer as a result of the rapid growth of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. American industrial growth was spectacular. And once World War I was over, and once industries in Western Europe were devastated, then the United States industrial machine was the only one left standing. The world was ours to dominate economically, and we did that. And ultimately, our goal was dictated by the priorities laid out in the Open Door Notes at the end of the 19th century and articulated in Woodrow Wilson's 14-point program. He wanted a peace based on the principles of freedom of the sea, general disarmament. No longer was he willing to accept a world where nations were armed to the teeth with large militaries, large navies, because his recognition was that if you put that much into your military capability, you're going to use it. And so he wanted nations willingly to disarm, not totally, but to maintain whatever armaments were necessary to maintain peace and stability within their own countries, domestic peace and stability, to put down insurrections, labor strikes, violence of various sorts, but not the kind of military buildup that would permit nations to go to war. So he wanted nations in the 14-point program, as part of the peace treaty at Versailles, to commit to freedom of the seas, free trade, elimination of tariff barriers, so that everybody was free to trade with everybody else. A throwback to the Open Door Notes, to the major powers when considering the China market at the turn of the century. In essence, then, the 14th program was a step-by-step outline of America's to reorient the world in our own image, so that the economic global community that we would lead and we would dominate. Part of Versailles, of the peace treaty, German colonies throughout the world as mandates. Africa, the Middle East, the Far East were meticulously assigned to key Western powers as economic mandates, not colonies, but economic dependencies. Specific developed nations were given under the treaty responsibilities to oversee the growth and development of underdeveloped areas in order to bring them into the sphere of developed civilized nations in the world. And thereby the plan was that the entire world would be integrated into this political, commercial sphere where everybody had the same goals, everybody had the same objectives, everybody was committed to the same principles and the same values: free and open trade, healthy competition among nations, but competition that was regulated, that was managed. All of this implied the need for an umpire, the need for some overseer to manage the world, to make sure that everybody abided by the rules and principles of the 14-point program. And in Wilson's plan, that was point 14, the creation of a League of Nations, the creation of an international body which would guarantee, through mutual sense of security, what the political science refer to as the principle of collective security, where nations would join together in order to enhance the security of all of its members by making sure that the members were largely disarmed. The only power of any substance would be wielded by the League when necessary. The idea was that if a hotspot or broke out anywhere in the world, nations would contribute the troops necessary to the League to put it down and rein in trouble and get everybody back on board. This was the world envisioned by Wilson. It was extremely idealistic, but at the same time, it made sense. It conformed to the political and economic priorities of most of the members. Wilson had no way of knowing that the participants in World War I went to the peace conference looking for revenge, looking to get even. They went to the peace conference with the idea of making Germany pay. The fact of the matter is, the only way that this plan for world peace could work successfully was to include Germany. Instead, Germany was treated as a non-participant. Germany was reduced and embarrassed before the world. And Germany vowed revenge. That revenge led to World War II and led to the failure of the League. But one other thing that led to the failure of the League, and this is our point, this is the point that I want to make, is that the United States of America refused to join the League. The plan was Wilson's. The idealism was Wilson's. The hope for the future, the scheme for economic cooperation, and the kind of international growth on a global scale that would lift all boats and allow everybody to prosper was Wilson's dream. But when the treaty was finally put together, containing many compromises that Wilson had to make in his 14-point program, the one compromise he would not make was the elimination of the League. He felt that all of it could only work if there was a League. The treaty came back to the United States, and because it was a treaty, it had to be ratified by the United States Senate. And leading Republicans in the United States Senate led opposition to the League and voted against ratifying the peace treaty. And Wilson spent the balance of his life traveling the country, speaking in behalf of the treaty, trying to get the voters, the people of the United States, to stand up and rebuff the Senate and force the Senate to go along with a plan that he believed would guarantee that World War I would be the war to end all wars. He literally killed himself in this effort. He had a debilitating stroke, spent the last months of his life bedfast and unable to govern. It became very clear as dictatorship began to emerge on the continent of Europe, with the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Lenin in the Soviet Union, the military in the Far East and Japan, it became very clear that to Roosevelt that the world was headed in a direction which seemed to promise another war. The League became a paper tiger. Without the United States being a member of it, the League became kind of a joke. When Italy moved into Ethiopia and threatened to seize Ethiopia in East Africa, the League took a position against it, and Mussolini moved anyway, and the League did nothing. When Hitler moved in Czechoslovakia, Neville Chamberlain came back from the League waving a piece of paper assuring the world that all Adolf Hitler wanted was the Sudetenland, was that German portion of Czechoslovakia that was populated principally by Germans. And then he took all of Czechoslovakia. Roosevelt saw this, along with Winston Churchill. They realized very clearly the mistakes that the world made after World War I. The first mistake was not including Germany, was treating Germany as the cause of World War I, which it was. But the treaty was put together by the victors. Germany was required to wait outside and come in and sign the final document, which included the famous war guilt clause, in which Germany was required to assume total responsibility for the devastation of World War I, along with a commitment to repay the nations of Europe for the damages incurred. Germany was humiliated. Roosevelt and Churchill began to realize that what was happening under Adolf Hitler in Germany suggested that the treatment of Germany was a horrendous mistake. What Churchill and Roosevelt were dealing with was a communist Russia under Lenin and later Stalin. And ultimately, they made the decision that whatever we do at the end of World War II, once it's over, we've got to have an international organization to make sure this never happens again. something like the League that Wilson had proposed. And we must make sure Soviet Union, Communist Russia, is part of that power structure. The only way to maintain the peace of the world is to make sure that everybody who could disrupt it is at the table and is directly involved in making the rules. The thinking was, I guess, if Germany had been allowed to participate in the peace treaty at the end of the war, if Germany had been allowed to contribute to the details of the peace treaty, we might have been able to avoid the frustration and the anger and the determination to get revenge that permeated Germany throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. My message, and we're right near the top of the hour, my message is that the United States in the Senate made the decision to withdraw from the world and to pursue foreign policy that was not directed by a league or by any international organization that would interfere with America's right to pursue its own self-interest. The United States insisted on remaining free and independent from international obligations. In fact, one of the arguments that Republicans used against the peace treaty, against Versailles, was that the requirements to take problems to the League violated our Constitution, as if the world was somehow going to organize itself around the details and ingredients of America's Constitution. It wasn't that the leaders in the Senate opposed the goals of Versailles. Rather, it was that the United States believed that its position of preeminence and power gave it the flexibility to pursue the goals of the League, the goals of the international community, without necessarily participating in the limitations and the restrictions that went along with such membership. If this doesn't sound familiar, this is exactly the behavior of Donald Trump this past week. It's not that we want to pollute the environment. It's not that we don't support the need for climate control. It's not that we don't endorse the idea of saving the planet. The belief is we can pursue all of those goals and work with those that are in the Paris Agreement without being in it ourselves. Therefore, we get our cake and eat it too. We get the benefits of the fact that all the world's nations, except us, are committed to a clean environment, which is what we're committed to, but we don't have to sign any papers or any obligations that oblige us to do anything. It's totally self-interested. It's a rejection of the term that scholars used to describe Wilson's League of Nations, collective security. The whole idea of collective security is the idea that the independence of nations who belong to the League is preserved. These nations remain independent. But at the same time, they become required to subscribe to the overall goals of the League, defined by the League, which means that we're free as long as being free and acting free doesn't disrupt the plans of everybody else. But if it does, we have to submit to the everybody else. The United States refused to do that. Donald Trump has refused to do that. Ultimately, we are rejecting the limitations and the restrictions that go along with collective membership. We want all the benefits. We don't want to have to pay any of the responsibilities or bear any of the responsibilities, any of the restrictions, any of the limitations on our freedom to operate, do what we want, when we want, where we want, why we want. I would suggest to you that that meant that the League could not function, that the League could not be successful. And nations of the world began to see it that way, as kind of a paper tiger that had a big roar but no teeth. The question that the world faces: is the world going to be able to do what's necessary to preserve the planet in the face of global change, climate change, when the second major burner of fossil fuels is not a member? Lawrence Summers, in his article, suggests that it's up to other people in the nation to make it clear to the world that Donald Trump is not America, and that Donald Trump does not speak for all of America. I would suggest to you that Donald Trump believes nothing like that. Donald Trump believes that he speaks for the nation and for the world. So are the Jerry Browns and the Bloombergs and the others who have moved in to claim that the United States, and especially the state of California, will continue to be leaders in efforts to preserve the climate? Is that going to be enough to counter the influence of Donald Trump? Once again, it all seems to come back to the Republican leadership in the House, but especially in the United States Senate. It's obvious that if the Paris Accords came back to the United States in the form of a treaty that had to be approved by the United States Senate, it would be rejected for the same reasons that the Republican-controlled Senate rejected the League of Nations in 1919. We've gone a little bit over our first hour. It's about 5 minutes after the hour. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. Then we'll come back and we'll proceed to engage in our second hour here at the Virtual Center. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to take a brief pause. I know Bob has some music there for the interlude. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. It's 12 minutes after the top of the hour, 12 minutes after 2 in the East. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to today's program. If you've been with us through our first hour, we thank you for staying here for the beginning of this, our second hour. Those of you who were here know, those of you who have just joined us, let me kind of bring you up to date. We spent our first hour talking principally about the realities of Donald Trump's decision to not participate in the Paris Climate Agreement from last week, and what this seemed to mean in terms of the total world situation as it existed. And it seemed to me that it's a mirror example of the same kinds of decisions made within the United States at the end of World War I, when a Republican-controlled United States Senate refused to ratify the peace treaty at the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. And in his efforts to continue to fight for the League of Nations, there's no question that it hastened the end of Woodrow Wilson's life. He pushed himself beyond what was humanly feasible in speaking around the country, trying to whip up support in opposition to the actions of the Republican leadership in the United States Senate. And ultimately, as we know, it killed him. It seemed to me that the similarities and the reasons are quite alike between the two situations. The Republican leadership at the time and the corporate leadership that's behind it, corporate interests, believed that it was that it was popular to secure all the benefits of being in the League without actually joining. We would do everything we could to work with the League, to work with the members of the League, to pursue our own self-interest. But at the same time, we weren't going to sign anything. We weren't going to do anything to limit our own options, our own freedom of action. We would do what we felt we needed to do for our own best interests. That, of course, ran totally contrary to the realities of League membership, to the whole philosophy of collective security. In order to guarantee the security of the world, Wilson believed, it was necessary for all the key players to come to the table and sit down and agree by signing on to the values and the principles around which the League's mission was to be defined. Given its role as the preeminent power in the world as a result of the devastation of World War I, America's decision to not join the League was, many historians believed, its death sentence. The question we all face is whether, in fact, Donald Trump's decision that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords might, in effect, be the death sentence for the successful efforts of the developed world to change policies and procedures which seem to be destroying the planet. As bad as President Trump's decision seems to be for America's role and America's leadership in the world, if it pretty much destroys the very foundation of the Paris Accords and the determination to successfully reverse the debasing and destruction of the planet loses or is not successful as a result, then President Trump's decision is much more devastating than it appears to most of us. It would be one thing to minimize the of effort to save the planet, which it seems to me is really more important than the priorities and the future of any member in the world family of nations. So that's really the issue, it seems to me. I would like to begin this second hour making us all aware once again of our phone number and invite you to take advantage of it, to go on the air and share your ideas on this issue or on other issues with our listeners. 663-46-304 Horn, Horn. Thoughts with me one-on-one via an email. I'd love to hear from you. My email address is at gmail.com. That's W.A. O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. And again, I do call your attention to our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, to the homepage, in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And again, I hadn't mentioned it at the beginning of our first hour, but let me mention it again, that there is a backup stream should any concern happen during the second hour of our program today, where the stream might go down. You can always go to headon.live, L-I-V-E, and that's a backup stream to the White Rose Society stream, which has been having some difficulty of late. So with that, I'd like to pick up on one facet of what we talked about in the first hour and use that as a means to getting into this, our second hour. Got to begin this with a sip of hot coffee, of course. What I'm talking about here specifically is the reliance that Lawrence Summers, we were focusing our first hour on the article written in this morning's New York Times by Lawrence Summers, former official in the Obama administration, former president of Harvard University, and professor of globalism and world politics at Harvard University still. And one of the issues I'd like to go to is Summers' realization of the role that Republican leadership must play in the direction that this nation goes. Remember, Summers is basically making the case for other leaders in the nation committed to reversing what appears to be destruction of the planet. His goal in this article is to encourage these people to stand up and be counted, and to basically announce to the world that President Trump doesn't speak for all of America, that many of the most prominent people in this nation will continue to do what they can in order to assist the effort of those in the Paris Accord to reverse the damage of climate change. As I mentioned in our last hour, all of this seems to come down to the role of the Republican leadership, principally in the Senate, but also in the House. Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, John McCain, who in the past, especially when he ran for president, was very, very assertive in his concern for and support of the planet. Basically, what Summers is talking about is that these people are going to have to find a way to separate themselves from being under the thumb of President Trump and being willing to stand up and assert themselves and assert the priorities of this nation. Obviously, Summers hopes that Trump does not speak for the nation in the position he's taken on the Paris Accords. This gets into the issues associated with the personality and the character of President Trump and the relations between him and not only other people in his administration, but other leaders, if you will, in this nation and in the Republican Party, in corporate America. One of the things that we've begun to see already in the first 4 months of the Trump presidency is an inclination for those that we expected would be opponents of President Trump. Instead, we're seeing clear indication that these people more and more are falling into line. That President Trump is managing his administration almost like the conductor of an orchestra. He is demanding total leadership, total loyalty. In fact, loyalty seems to be the basic premise for appointment into this administration. There's a lot of discussion going on about the degree to which prominent Americans need to think twice about accepting positions in this administration, because clearly this president is making decisions which are going to reverberate on the reputations and the futures of members of his administration. Last week, right at the end of May, I had found an article which spoke to this and seemed to suggest that there was a very subtle but very real change going on in the way the spokesmen for the Trump administration were reacting to the media. The extent to which they were becoming pure spokesmen for the president and nothing else. It almost seemed that we were not dealing with the president of a republic, an elected president of a republic, with committed professionals who were willing to commit to the service of their nation by accepting positions in this administration, that somehow there seemed to be a very subtle change. And the result was that many of these people were becoming automatons. They were becoming lackeys. They were basically mouthing the administration strategy, if you will, without question. They were defending the president's inclination to contradict himself. In many cases, they were out there defending untruths. The most obvious example of this, of course, is Sean Spicer, the communications director. Jenna Johnson, in an article in the Washington Post on May 30th, makes the case that a lot of these people are almost channeling the president. When the president returned from his overseas trip last weekend and began to resume his duties the first of this past week in the country, Sean Spicer and some of the other spokesmen for the administration began to talk about the successes of the overseas trip as if it was something different than what we all know and saw happen. Sean Spicer said last Tuesday, quote, It truly was an extraordinary week for America and our people, Sean Spicer said. 9 times he made mention of the fact that the president's first overseas trip was historic. He said that President Trump's speech to the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations, quote, was a historic turning point that people will be talking about for years to come, and was met with nearly universal praise, unquote. He claimed before the media that President Trump had single-handedly united the civilized world in the fight against terrorism and extremism, and that his meetings in the Group of Seven, G7, in Sicily were marked by outstanding success, unquote. To quote Spicer in his press conference last Tuesday, "We've never seen before at this point in any presidency such sweeping reassurance of American interests and the inauguration of a foreign policy strategy designed to bring back the world from growing dangers and perpetual disasters brought on by years of failed leadership." Jenna Johnson, the author of this piece, makes the point that much of this total deference to the president, to the boss, seemed almost to sound like something that we'd hear in North Korea, dedicated to the dear leader. The implication being, is Donald Trump assuming the same role over his folks as the dear leader does in North Korea? Hope Hicks, another spokesman for the administration, defended the president when the media began to question the way the president seemed to be demeaning his staff. And in the Washington Post said this. This is Hope Hicks. "President Trump has a magnetic personality and exudes positive energy, which is infectious to those around him. He has an unparalleled ability to communicate with people. He is brilliant with a great sense of humor," unquote. Sean Spicer made the comment, "Ultimately, the best president of the president's messenger of the president's message is the president himself," Spicer said. "He's always proven that he's the best messenger, not just for what he wants to articulate, but that the American people resoundingly chose him as their president because he understands the frustrations and concerns and values of the American people, and he's probably the best person to communicate that," unquote. This kind of total loyalty, almost bordering on adoration, seems to suggest the degree of control and dominance that seems to be required by this president from those who support him and who serve him in his administration. If you think about it, this is unlike anything we've ever seen in this country before. This goes well beyond the pale of loyalty. Of course, we expect members of an administration to be loyal to the chief executive. That has to happen in any organization. I can remember in higher education. I know for a fact in business situations that I've been exposed to. Managers, CEOs demand loyalty. They encourage people to speak their minds and to take issue with the leader or the CEO or the manager until the decision is made. But once the decision's made, they expect everybody to get on board and support it. That we expect. That we understand. But this kind of fawning, channeling, almost hero worship that we're hearing coming out of the mouths of these spokesmen is a bit frightening, especially given the message that Lawrence Summers gives us this morning, namely, that we have to depend on the credibility and the quality of the people around the president to speak up and let it be known that when it comes to a decision that was clearly not the right one, the best one for America, that these people will stand up and send to the world the message that Donald Trump doesn't speak for the whole nation, and that many of the prominent leaders in this country plan to do what they can to support the efforts of those still in the Paris Accord. It doesn't sound to me like the trend is headed in the right direction for Summers to be correct. It seems to me that what Summers is calling for is being contradicted almost every single day by the behavior of those in the Trump administration charged with meeting the public and helping to communicate the message of the administration to the public at large. I guess what I'm saying is, it doesn't seem that these people are willing to take issue with this president, because there's no question, once he gets crossed, once you end up in his crosshairs, revenge seems to be a number one priority for him. I heard David Ignatius this morning talking about President Trump's personality of leadership. And he makes the point that when somebody takes issue with him, somebody contradicts him, challenges him, he doubles down. He never backs off. Rather, he comes back stronger than ever. Today, he's giving us an example of that on this issue of the travel ban. Now that the courts, on more than one occasion, have blocked his effort to limit the immigration of Muslim immigrants from 6 specified Muslim nations into the United States for a 90-day period, which theoretically gives us 90 days to check and make sure that they are not terrorists and whatever. The president has taken the latest rebuff from the courts, and instead of going back to the drawing board, he's criticizing those in his Justice Department who did go back to the drawing board and try to make revisions in the ban which would be sufficient to get the courts to go along with it. What he's saying this morning in one of his tweet storms, so to speak, was that what we need to do is back off what the Justice Department tried to do and go back to the original travel ban. In other words, let's not water it down. Let's not let political correctness rule the day here. Let's put our cards on the table. Let's do what we need to do in order to make sure that this nation is secure from the kind of terrorist situations which Great Britain has experienced 3 times in the last 3 months. As David Ignatius says, he seems to double down. He doesn't take criticism well at all. It never, ever enters his mind that those taking issue with him might in some way be right. That maybe he ought to take a step back and reflect and reconsider his positions in light of the opposition. Rather, he just comes on with both barrels, and as the expression goes, he doubles down on his initial perspective or point of view. That, to me, doesn't seem conducive to the kind of independence that Lawrence Summers is relying upon in response to this latest decision about refusing to sign on to the Paris Accord. You know, it's interesting. On the 31st of May, the day after that particular article appeared in the Washington Post, Thomas Friedman in the New York Times wrote an article which said pretty much the same thing. In other words, what I'm suggesting here are patterns. The president has been in office long enough now, so we're beginning to get a fairly good idea. There's data out there to support some of this stuff. We're not speculating anymore. We've got an awful lot of examples of decisions and policies that the president has supported, which gives us some foundation, some basis for our predictions not being just speculations, but being based on some hard evidence. Thomas Friedman, when he wrote this, was touring the South Pacific. He had been to New Zealand, Australia, and South Korea. And the question he kept talking about, what people were asking him is, what's going on with the United States? Friedman's answer, he says, that we are no longer the United States of America. We are now the United American Emirate. Let me quote you a paragraph from Friedman. This says it all. He says, quote, "We have an emir. His name is Donald. We have a crown prince. His name is Jared. We have a crown princess. Her name is Ivanka. We have a consultative council, Congress, that rubber stamps whatever the emir wants. And like any good monarchy, our ruling family sees no conflict of interest between its personal business and those of the state." Unquote. That is an unbelievable statement, especially coming from an establishment op-ed writer like Thomas Friedman. Thomas Friedman has always been one of the most insightful commentators on what's going on in Washington. He's done that for years. He's one of the world's authorities on Middle Eastern politics. There's no doubting that. But he's never been in a situation where he's taken positions so clearly at odds with those in power in this country. He's disagreed with decisions coming out of Washington in the past, but never taken positions that are as diametrically different as he is now. Think of this. We have an emir. His name is Donald. We have a crown prince. His name is Jared. We have a crown princess. Her name is Ivanka. We have a consultative Congress that rubber stamps whatever the emir wants. Our ruling family never sees any conflict of interest between its personal business and those of the state. And then Trump goes into a parody on John F. Kennedy, on the famous speech in John F. Kennedy's inaugural. This is what he says applies now. Any lingering Kennedy-esque thoughts about us should be banished. Let every nation know, he says, and this is obviously a parody or paraphrase on John F. Kennedy. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay no price, bear no burden, meet no hardship, support no friend, oppose no foe, to assure the success of liberty, unless we're paid in advance. We take cash, checks, gold, Visa, American Express, Bitcoin, and memberships at Mar-a-Lago. And then Friedman proceeds to talk about how to get along with this administration. If you are a foreign power, it's become to Friedman very clear what you have to do or what you can't do in order to get on the right side of the Trump administration. Buy weapons from us. And he said, I remind you, Saudi Arabia has set the bar pretty high, starting at $110 billion. Pay us in higher defense spending for NATO. Trade concessions. Doesn't even matter how weak those concessions are, as long as they are concessions that the emir can claim point to his success in world affairs. One of the points that he makes, pay us by grossly flattering our emir about how much of an improvement he is over Barack Obama. And he said one factor also is that if you do these things, you're on our good side. We don't care what goes on out back behind the scenes. You can deprive your people of whatever human rights you want out back. You can be as corrupt as you want out back. You can steal as many elections as you like out back. Just keep the arms purchases coming, the NATO dues rising, the phony trade concessions flowing, and the compliments gushing. Either that or be Vladimir Putin and pay nothing. It's one of the most critical pieces, negative pieces, that I've ever seen Tom Friedman write about any administration, and I've been reading him through a lot of presidencies. And I think it's very significant what he's saying about this one. Finally, and we're getting close to the end of our program today. We've got about 12 minutes left in our program, just a little bit more than 10 minutes. So I don't want to get into anything totally different here than what we've already been into. But one of the things I find interesting, and I'm hoping you would, this is kind of ending on a, I was going to say ending on a light note, but actually it's not really light. we hear all the time of people comparing some of the things coming out of Washington with what we've seen in literature in the past. How many people have you between what's going on in Washington and Orwell's 4, or Brave New World, or Fahrenheit 451? Those pieces. One of the things we hear now, are comparisons from Harry Potter. Many of those people who are big fans of Harry Potter, apparently a research project was conducted, and the survey results indicated that people who supported or who favored Harry Potter were very likely to dislike Taunton. When she got the results of this in The Guardian, J.K. Rowling, the creator of Harry Potter, tweeted that those results made my day, unquote. Situation for those that are at all familiar with Harry Potter. Comparison between Donald Trump and the villain in Harry Potter, Voldemort, are striking. The assumption that what we need is a Dumbledore, somebody who can organize the opposition, stand up to evil, stand up to Voldemort, which is kind of what Lawrence Summers is asking for. This particular article introduces some other literature which might go a long way toward even better making the point about some of the issues going on within the Trump administration for those that would criticize it. One is a novel written by Evelyn Waugh in the late 1930s. I think it was 1939, called The Scoop. It's about extremism in journalism. What catches my mind about this, what caught my attention, is, as most of you can, I can remember studying American history when our textbooks got to the Spanish-American War. Everything any of us ever knew about the term yellow journalism was grounded in the behavior of William Randolph Hearst at the time of the Spanish-American War, when he began to send reporters to Cuba, right just before the United States ended up declaring war on Spain over the explosion on the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. And William Randolph Hearst began to send reporters to Cuba. And the famous quotation that was in many of our textbooks, and I can remember it well, was the statement that Hearst wrote to one of his reporters about getting pictures. And he said to me, "Don't worry about the context. You send me the pictures, we'll create the war." And out of this came most of our understanding of the concept of extremism in journalism, the idea of so-called yellow journalism, the idea that the media didn't just report the news, but actually created it. Evelyn Waugh's book, Scoop, does just that. In that novel, a young reporter is sent to East Africa to cover a war there. The anticipation was that it's going to be a delightful little war that's going to be worth a lot of positive publicity, and it's not going to cost us too much. The reporter writes back to the Home Office in London the following, quote, "Isn't it very confusing if we all send different news? Because obviously it leads to the idea of choice." The response is that if they all have different policies, of course, they're all going to have different news. What I'm thinking here is this issue of alternative facts. What I'm getting into here is the fact that depending on the ideological bent of a particular network, what's covered differs from what's covered on other networks. If you watch MSNBC, you're hearing all about Comey, all about the Russian connection, all about Michael Flynn, all about Putin, all about the banker in Russia who had secret meetings with Flynn. If you turn to Fox News, you're getting some of that, but not much of it. Mostly what you're getting is criticism of a mainstream media campaign to undo the Trump administration. So in a sense, if you follow one network and one network only, your view of the news of what's happening over time is going to end up to be materially different than what I'm getting on the news. How can there be two newses? I would suggest to you that partisanship, ideological division in this country has so divided us that each camp is generating its own news. And it depends on where your preferences are as to where you get your news. What you know, what you think about what's going on. What we are seeing here is a breakdown in the role of the media, in the role of journalism in our republic. Because the whole idea of journalism was based on the idea that there's one news. There's only one set of facts. Different groups of people differ on those facts, but the facts always remain the same. What we have seen is that in this country, partisanship has become so extreme that it's actually generating independent news. Which means, by definition, that the media has become the voice of a particular ideological position on events. It is not in the business any longer of informing the American public, but has clearly reverted into a perspective of persuading the American public on a particular point of view. Instead of the media becoming what one political science referred to as the fourth branch of government, it was seen so vital. It was always been pointed out that it's not an accident that freedom of the press is right up there at the top in our Bill of Rights. One political scientist, as I mentioned, referred to the media as the fourth branch of government. It's so critical to the operation of our republic. Obviously, our media has ceased to perform that constitutional function, and instead has become something quite different. A mouthpiece for a particular position. It's kind of interesting because some of the most critical literature I've been reading of late refers to the has been being one of this, pointing out that Hugh Hewitt, conservative talk show host in Wisconsin, conservative op-ed writer for years for the Washington Post, is now going to have a regular slot on MSNBC. Many people are critical of that. They think it's going to besmirch the ideological purity of MSNBC. All of that speaks to a view of the role of the media, which is extreme. I don't think it's the top of the hour. We've completed our Monday here on this June 5th for the Head On Radio Network and for us here at the virtual. This will bring you so very much. I invite you tomorrow. Be kind to each other, and thank you.